Welcome everyone to this fifth episode of Raise Your Hand Live, a monthly talk show, Future and Education Changemakers. I'm Mohammed Sidibe, your host. We're less than 100 days away from the Global Education Summit that aims to raise at least $5 billion for GPE to help transform education in over 90 countries and territories. As we speak, education advocates across the world last week were celebrating Education Action Week and calling on world leaders to commit to more, better funding for education, be it domestically or to support education in lower income countries. The stakes are higher than ever. If we don't act now to tackle this learning crisis and protect and improve education financing, an entire generation is at risk. Here with me to discuss how we must work together to invest in the generation that will build a better future are Acting Chief Executive Officer for the One Campaign and Minister David Moinina Sengeh, Minister of Basic and Senior Secondary Education and Chief Innovative Officer for the Republic of Sierra Leone. David, Tom, welcome. Even if children are in school, far too many of them aren't learning. More than half of all children in low and middle income countries cannot read proficiently by age 10. To respond to this learning crisis, education systems needs to be transformed, not tweaked. Driving transformation is at the heart of how GPE works, and GPE's new strategic plan will help country partners to prioritize areas that, based on evidence, can have the most transformative and systemic impact. David, you are on a mission to radically improve my country, your country, our country's education system, driven by commitments to radical inclusion. Can you tell us what will drive this transformation and what it will take to improve learning for all?
Thank you, Mohammed. I think part of what now is apparent is that actually pre-COVID, we were not on the path to meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 4. Is that the learning gap was already there. We just never had a focused conversation around it. And what's become apparent is that the gap between those who have and those who do not have across countries and within countries is quite large. And you have economies or countries that say they are doing universal access to quality education, but the poor and the marginalized or some neighborhoods are often left out. And as we have now seen that devices or connectivity or teaching platforms and all of those things that became important that represented what learning and continuous learning is, showed that there was a difference between amongst the population. It underscored the reason to, as you said, transform learning and education. And I think part for us in Sierra Leone, one of our ethos and something we just did to really represent that is the policy on radical inclusion in schools. Now, this policy says that it's targeting 4 different groups. It's girls, pregnant girls, and teenage girls with teenage pregnancy and parent learners. It's targeting kids with disabilities, physical, cognitive, psychosocial. It's targeting kids who are from rural and hard to reach areas, remote areas. And it's targeting people from poor backgrounds. And you see that if we include all of these different groups in particular, we'll be able to bring along and bring to par, not like we're just dragging them, make sure that they can have access to the same opportunities to access, stay in, and complete school, because that really matters, and that these schools can be safe learning spaces for them, irrespective of who you are. And I think when we have a mandate of all means all radical inclusion for us in Sierra Leone, then we'll be able to really transform learning for all. And we've done this firstly by cabinet last year, March, lifting the ban that existed on all pregnant girls to attend school and take exam. And the ministry then developed this policy and got that policy also passed. And we've invested a lot more in Braille and in other resources for disability inclusion. and brought those on board. And in our programs, I've gone to places where the road ends. I go into a boat and I commute in the boat for an hour to meet people who've never met a minister before or a senior government official. And so we're actively implementing these policies as well.
It's interesting that you mentioned everything that you've just mentioned, David, because I remember going to school right after the war in Sierra Leone. And like you said, I was one of those children in poor, in the slums growing up and without really ever like meeting like a minister or having a minister of education that's accessible. And this whole notion of like radical inclusion is something that as a Sierra Leonean, I'm so proud of to say like, okay, we have someone like David who is, it's you're an easy to access, easy to reach ministers, and you really are transforming education. And I see the trajectory of how learning is going to Sierra Leone, things that I never had that I wish I had, but I'm now so happy that a lot of young Sierra Leoneans have you as the head of the educational system with the focus of using evidence-based approach to transform the educational system in Sierra Leone. Tom, the One campaign just launched the Lost Potential Tracker, a great tool that showcases what's at risk if we continue with this business as usual approach. Why the focus on learning and what can be done to change the course of this crisis?
So over the past year, obviously the pandemic has affected kids going to school everywhere on the planet. From sudden school closures to difficulties of home learning, everyone has been struggling. I've seen it myself as a parent. But as David mentioned, the reality of the education crisis didn't just happen as a result of the pandemic. In fact, as you'll see in the Lost Potential Tracker, and I want to thank GPE and Save the Children for coming on board as partners with us to launch this Lost Potential Tracker. But as you'll see in it, more than 393 million children and counting have failed to gain the basic literacy skills that you would normally expect a 10-year-old to gain. And that's just since 2015, since we launched the Sustainable Development Goals. The poorest countries, of course, are hit the hardest. And this is an astonishing figure. 9 out of 10 kids in the poorest countries haven't reached that basic literacy point when they transition from learning to read to beginning to read in order to learn. Critical moment in the learning process. 9 out of 10 kids in low-income countries, and that was before COVID hit. And again, it represents 393 million kids. I just want to pause on that for a second. That's more than the entire population of the United States. So being able to set kids up for a lifetime of learning by being able to be able to read and comprehend is what we're trying to dramatize in this Lost Potential Tracker. So we are trying to count as many children as we can who are at risk and demonstrate the growing scale of the crisis. So what we need to do is dramatize it because this is a key moment. This year is critical. Boris Johnson is the head of the G7. He's welcoming all the world leaders to a G7 meeting later this summer. And he has said education is one of his priorities. And it's just urgent that these rich countries, wealthy countries of the G7 partner with developing countries in order to tackle this learning crisis. And that critically, the Global Partnership for Education is having what we call a replenishment or a pledging conference, a fundraising conference, where they aim to raise $5 billion over the next 5 years in order to alleviate the global learning crisis. So what we have to do is overcome this just colossal failure in leadership in developing and developed countries as well on both sides to help make sure that every kid doesn't lose their God-given potential and is able to live the life of dignity that we would all hope.
I think it's really important because, one of the things that you've mentioned, that David has mentioned, is this notion of opportunity. And that sometimes what's missing is not just like it's not just the education system, but the education systems needs to be paired with access and opportunity for every child, for the children that David arrives, and then take a boat or a car 2 hours to reach the far remote areas of people who never really think their lives could change. And that we do need people who believe in changing the system. See, the future from where we stand now is mirrored in great uncertainty created by the pandemic. Now more than ever, we need collective and sustained action to guarantee learning continues and that human capital development, particularly education, always be protected and championed as a source of growth and progress. I mean, GPE Raise Your Hand financing campaign is a chance for leaders globally and nationally to step up and commit to ending the learning crisis. Tom, let me start with you as one has been a fervent advocate for more effective education financing for many years. Given the scale of the challenge, what must be done to protect, increase, and diversify support for education?
Let me go to one of the stories you'll read on the Lost Potential Tracker. It's of 10-year-old Esther from Nigeria, who, like so many kids, had a lifelong dream of becoming a medical doctor as a means of giving back to her community. Brilliant student, passionate about life and the future ahead of her. But the pandemic meant that her school was shuttered and her dad lost his job. So now she's not sure that she'll be in a position to become a doctor, let alone even return to school. So her dreams of tomorrow are really at risk of disappearing. The reality is that the loss of learning is felt globally. We know children from the most poverty-stricken communities and countries are most at risk of falling through the cracks. And that's what the tracker is meant to dramatize. We've seen that aid education is expected to decline by double digits due to COVID-19. And 2/3 of governments in low-income countries have already cut their education budgets. And look, I get it. If I were a finance minister, I understand trying to pour as many resources as you can to tackle the pandemic, but you just cannot take that out of education. It is incredibly short-sighted and will ultimately make your job of building back better more difficult. So we believe that at the One Campaign, that obviously the importance of education for kids is important in its own right, so that kids have the opportunity to reach their full potential. But education is a catalyst for almost everything else that we're hoping to do, particularly in the Sustainable Development Goals. Improvements in education outcomes have, among other things, shown to lift people out of extreme poverty, improve health outcomes, save lives, reduce child marriage, improve economic growth, reduce the impact of climate change. There are very few silver bullets in sustainable development, but education comes darn close. So we really have to push. We need to step up this year to protect and expand education budgets. And that means for donor countries like mine in the US, or Minister Morton in the UK, or other countries like France, Canada, EU, and others, they've got to play their part to support GPE and support that $5 billion that we've talked about. Anyway, so we're very much hoping that the wealthier countries will step up this summer to support GPE and the kinds of programs and efforts that David was talking about earlier.
Boys and girls who want to be something, to be a teacher, to be a doctor, to be a scientist, to be a minister, but yet their dreams have to be deferred, not because their lack of, not because they lack the ability or the ethics to work, but because they don't have the resources needed to continue that education. And so they're forced to defer these dreams that never really become a reality. David, there are many demands on national resources in the current environment. How do you make the case for governments amid competing priorities to protect and increase their allocation to education and to do so effectively?
Yeah, I didn't know the number, Tom, that 2/3 LMICs have cut their education budget. Sierra Leone is not one of them. In fact, Sierra Leone is perhaps one of the only countries that has expanded its education budget. Within COVID, we went from 21% to 20 to 21, and now we're at 22% of our government budget. And I think I was looking at some World Bank metrics just the other day in terms of public education spending, where I think one of the top countries globally, because His Excellency President Julius Maada Bio has a commitment to universal, free, quality school education, from preschool, expansion in preschool, all the way through to senior secondary school, and for university, if you're a female student or somebody who is doing STEM. And for us in Sierra Leone, it really was, and I wrote about this in Financial Times recently with the Minister of Finance. Luckily, the Minister of Finance is also a believer in human capital development. Human capital development is our flagship program, and we know as Tom was saying, if you think it's expensive today, it's going to be more expensive tomorrow and in 10 years when your population is not well equipped. And we're starting from a deficit, right? Our literacy numbers are very low, particularly if you're an adult woman living in a rural community. So these things that we're doing is driven by data and driven by evidence. And when you're speaking with evidence and data, it becomes obvious that where your money has to go is in education. And so for us, that really has been the main driver. So the political will, strong political will from His Excellency President Madabio and the Minister of Finance, and really just focus on data and evidence is also one of the reasons. And you see that education. Look, think about maternal mortality. In Sierra Leone has one of the worst maternal mortality in the world, but we know that about 40% of all pregnancies, I think about 40 to 50%, are 19-year-olds and below. That means they're having sex when they're in school, and that means they're getting pregnant in their final year of school. So if you invest in education and you know the numbers of girls finish secondary school, then they are less likely to get pregnant. And we know that 40% of all maternal mortality is under 19-year-olds. So you can reduce maternal mortality by up to 50% if you just focus on girls completing secondary school. And it's these simple and obvious connections, perhaps, that we need to make.
The evidence-based approach that, far too often in countries like ours, David, and even in my second home, this is the US, education becomes so politicized. And that people forget that it should be based on evidence. Like, fine, like, yes, we do need the politics to get the money, and it's amazing to hear that Sierra Leone has increased expanded its education budget from 20% to 22%. And a time where there are so many competing interests and people cutting back on education. Is always education is on the back burner. We have this notion of we have these forward-looking ideas, but yet we keep taking backward steps when it comes to making sure every child has an equal access to education. And evidence, it really should be based on evidence-based approach to ensuring that every child around the world have access to quality education. As you know, GPE is asking world leaders and supporters to raise their hands to fund education through GPE, because every change starts with a powerful act, which can be as simple as raising your hand in a classroom. Will each of you take this opportunity to tell us why you raise your hand for GPE?
I raise my hand for inclusive education, and I raise my hand such that every girl, every child, irrespective of who you are, where you are, what your background is, can access, stay in, and complete school, because that's our only option for inclusive national development.
From our lost potential tracker, 393 million children and counting have failed to gain the basic literacy that you would expect from a 10-year-old. And behind every one of those stats is a child, is a kid like Esther. So I'm raising my hand for GPE because I believe that every child should be able to secure their future and not lose that potential that they all have. So we've got to pick up the pace. Leaders in countries across the globe have got to step up in order to secure these kids' futures.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, David. And Tom, thanks for the work that you are doing at the One Foundation and all the amazing things that you continue to do to support GPE. David, you are a true son of Africa, and as a Sierra Leonean, I am proud to know that we have someone like you championing the cause of every child in Sierra Leone, irrespective of their family status. So thank you to the both of you for joining us, for joining me in this wonderful conversation. Thank you both. We were hoping to have Wendy Morton, UK Minister for European Neighbourhoods and Americas, with us today, but unfortunately due to conflict, she wasn't able to join us. But we did send her some questions, and this is what she has to say. Minister Morton, 2021 is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to tackle the learning crisis. And the UK is set to stand at the forefront. Under the UK's presidency, girls' education will be put at the heart of the G7. And in July, Prime Minister Johnson will co-host the Global Education Summit with President Kenyatta from Kenya. How can the UK and global leaders help raise the learning tide for all including for the most vulnerable girls?
Thank you for the question. It's a really important point. And look, this is a critical moment for us to tackle the learning crisis. Between 2015 and 2020, the UK has supported 15.6 million children, including over 8 million girls, to gain a decent education. But what we see is that the pandemic has affected almost everyone around the world in one way or another. And critically, children are missing out on education. At the height of school closures, 1.6 billion children and young people were out of education. And girls' education is at the heart of the UK's G7 presidency. So we're urging our partners around the world to get behind two goals. Firstly, to see 40 million more girls in school. And secondly, 20 million more reading by the age of 10 in low and lower middle income countries. And these are really important goals. And we are urging leaders to increase their financial and their political commitment to girls' education. What we need is we need world leaders to step up and make sure that GPE is properly financed so that it can deliver for the next 5 years and give 175 million children the opportunity to learn. And we're really proud to be co-hosting the Global Education Summit in July with Kenya, so we can help ensure that GPE can continue the crucial work that it does.
Wendy, as you were saying these numbers, it's really hard, in the world where we are thinking about colonizing Mars and sending people to Mars, yet we have 150 and more million children, girls in particular, unable to go to school. And we know that whenever there is a crisis, whether it be natural or man-made, girls always suffer as a byproduct of these crises, even though they don't have much to do with it. The future from where we stand is mirrored in great uncertainty created by the pandemic. Now more than ever, we need collective and sustained action to guarantee learning continues and the human capital development, particularly education, always be protected and championed as a source of growth and progress. GPU Raise Your Hand financing campaign is a chance for leaders globally and nationally to step up and commit to ending the learning crisis. Wendy, as a global community, we know that the power of education to create a better, more sustainable and resilient future. Despite this, global education continues to be the orphan of the aid sector. Under the leadership of the UK, how can we drive a tangible step change and translate political will into sustained donor financing to education, starting with a fully funded GPE?
Mohammed, it's true that education is competing with other sectors for donor attention. And there are interventions like vaccination that can deliver faster returns. But the UK takes a long view. And all the evidence shows that girls' education can stop poverty in its tracks between generations. So that's why we invest and are pressing others to step up during 2021. The COVID recovery really does depend upon it. But secondly, let's also remember that aid makes up less than 1% of total finance for education globally. In fact, the overwhelming majority of resources come from national governments themselves. And that's the beauty of the GPE partnership model. By providing $5 billion over 5 years to GPE, donors will be unlocking over 10 times that amount in commitments from national governments. And yes, it's a difficult time, and there are huge constraints on economies as a result of the pandemic, but we can't lose any more time. We need to give GPE the funding it needs to increase the number of children who are in school and also who are learning. We know what works, and since its creation in 2002, GPE has contributed to the largest expansion of primary and lower secondary schooling in history, supporting around 160 million children into school, including 82 million girls. So we know it works, but we need donors to realise that this is the moment to ensure we get children back into school and learning, and that they act by pledging to GPE. Educating girls is one of the smartest investments we can make to lift people out of poverty, to grow economies, to save lives, and importantly, to build back better from COVID-19.
Thank you, Wendy. Hearing you speak about the importance of funding GPE and funding education, and of course, education always competing with other sectors. I mean, we all know like education works. It's just a matter of like political will and putting the money in systems to transform these education systems around the world. As you know, GPE is asking world leaders and supporters to raise their hands to fund education through GPE because every change starts with a powerful act, which can be as simple as raising your hand in the classroom. Will you take this opportunity to tell us why you raise your hand for GPE?
I'm raising my hand because I know that educating girls is extremely powerful. Investing in education has wider benefits for girls are much less likely to suffer from violence, sexual abuse, child marriage. I raise my hand for GPE because I believe that educating children is one of the most powerful ways that we can change.
Thank you very much for joining us for this wonderful conversation. And we welcome the UK's support in taking leadership and ensuring that children everywhere have access to quality and inclusive education. I would like to thank everyone. Remember, every change starts with a powerful act. Thank you, Minister Morton, for joining me.